I thank the member. Recognize the member from Vancouver West End.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Well, wine on a Monday morning, it must be the legislature. No, to be serious, thank you to the member for his statement. I'm speaking today about the public sector and about reducing emissions, climate change emissions in the public sector. As members will know, climate change is a very real and present threat to both our economy, our society, and of course our environment. We've seen severe weather systems, of course, hit Calgary, Toronto, and of course British Columbia as well. Now, some will talk about how climate change and the environment is a threat to the economy, and some will say acting against climate change can be a threat to the economy and resource jobs. But we know that resource jobs in our province are threatened by climate change, whether or not we think of the forestry jobs that we've lost due to pine beetle, the huge forest fires we've seen because of the unseasonably warm summers, and of course not every wild weather event we can pin down because of climate change, but many we can see are due in part to changing weather patterns due to our emissions into the atmosphere. So the public sector, government, we as leaders of the public have a responsibility to do all we can for our children, and that means reducing our own emissions. Of course, we all create emissions in our workplaces through buildings. That's about 80% of the emissions created in British Columbia public sector come through our buildings. Nearly around 750,000 tons or so of climate change emissions are created in that way. Now that's hospitals, that's schools, that's universities, that's BC Housing, to list a few. Of course, we have a new emission standard that the government's created through the Pacific Carbon Trust, where you have to pay out from the public sector $25 a ton for every climate change emission you make. Now, of course, they pay $25 a ton, and then the Pacific Carbon Trust goes out and buys an offset, they call them, for sometimes as low as $11 a ton, and they say that then has offsetted and created carbon neutrality. So how much are we paying out, Honourable Speaker? We're paying out about $18 million a year from the public sector going out to the Pacific Carbon Trust, and then they invest it in largely private sector projects. So for the 3 years, approximately $52 million have gone out of the public sector into private sector projects, projects the Auditor General has criticized as potentially being free riders, projects that would already happen and wouldn't be requiring a subsidy from government, and that's been the concern from the Auditor General and from the general public. So that's $52 million, give or take, over 3 years, less money going into health services, education, and the other things we would expect from the public service. Now the government will say, well, we've given $10 million back, $10 million back to schools so that they can invest in climate change reducing projects. Well, my argument here today, Honourable Speaker, is all that money should go back. We need to put the $30 million that sits currently in a surplus back into the public sector so they can reduce emissions now. I believe it's our obligation to reduce our own emissions. I also believe that the private sector has an ability and desire, in many cases, to reduce emissions too. But it should not be the job of schools, colleges, hospitals, care homes to be subsidizing private sector reductions, which also lead to increased profitability. I think about the Encana project, a project which, according to the Auditor General, had already happened, was already done, before receiving subsidies from the Pacific Carbon Trust. This is a project which led to greater profitability for the company. This is a company that does not pay the carbon tax for its process emissions. Meanwhile, the public sector pays for the emissions created through use of gas, but also pays for the offsets. So here we have a problem where the public sector, the taxpayer, the health services, the universities, the colleges are paying doubly, and then subsidizing a private corporation, a profitable private corporation, for a project that the Auditor General says would already happen. Wouldn't it be better, Honourable Speaker, if we put the money that's generated here back into retrofits, back into the public sector, back into universities and colleges so they could reduce their building costs, so they could save money each and every year on energy costs, so that the money that we provide as taxpayers to them is actually used for the services we expect. I don't think people would imagine that the money that they are investing into their hospitals and schools would end up helping reduce the cost of a hot tub at a resort in Whistler. But, Honourable Speaker, that's in fact what happens. You put the money into the Carbon Trust, it then gets refunneled out to a private business to reduce their emissions. Now, surely we should look at reducing emissions in the private sector, but is it the public's job to pay for those emission reductions? Is it our job through universities and colleges and cuts that happen there to subsidize reductions elsewhere? I think people would be very surprised to know that that's how it works. But, Honourable Speaker, it's been working that way for 3 years. And we see now that the surplus is set to grow to $37 million each year because of buying carbon offsets high, forcing the public sector to pay $25 a ton, and then buying offsets low for $11 a ton in many cases. You're creating a large surplus which just grows each and every year. Well, Honourable Speaker, we need to invest in the public sector. We need to, for example, BC Housing provides many homes for British Columbians, is paying $650,000 out. We have the Fraser Health Authority, $1 million, Interior Health, $1 million, Northern Health, $600,000, Vancouver Coastal Health, $1.1 million. All of those costs should be going back to the places they come from so that they can reduce emissions now. Because a scheme that says it reduces emissions but has been pointed out has actually sometimes paid for emissions that have already been reduced does not get you climate change emissions. It just gets you moving dollars from one hand to the other. We need real reductions of climate change emissions in the public sector. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.